Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're diving into Wednesday, April 9th, 2025.
A date which I've seen some commentators calling Liberation Day.
Liberation Day, yeah. And for those of you who aren't totally up to speed on why that is, this is the day that President Trump's reciprocal tariffs officially went into effect. So we've gotten a bunch of articles and analyses on this, and, let's try to unpack it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty big moment. It's really a completely different way of approaching trade for the United States. So essentially, as these sources detail, we've got this two-pronged approach. One is a flat, baseline 10% tariff on every single good imported into the U.S.
Just across the board.
Yeah. And then on top of that, you have steeper reciprocal tariffs that were aimed at 86 countries that the White House identified as having high barriers to trade with the U.S.
Right.
So it's kind of like this 1-2 punch.
A 1-2 punch, yeah. So what we want to do in this deep dive is kind of cut through the headlines and figure out what's the actual thinking behind this. What is the logic or lack thereof, maybe, that these economists are looking at? What's the immediate fallout in kind of the global economy?
Right, and we want to understand how these tariffs actually work and what's sort of the immediate reaction, and then what does the analysis say about the potential long-term consequences?
Yeah, so let's break down this 1-2 tariff punch a little bit. So the events leading up to April 9th, it's interesting. So around March 20th, there was an executive order that was anticipated, which would initiate these Section 232 investigations into certain sectors like pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals, these things that are usually seen as national security.
Yeah, exactly. So those Section 232 investigations are based around whether imports in these sectors threaten national security.
Right.
And that always has the potential for future tariffs.
Right.
Then, if we fast forward a little bit to April 2nd, we saw President Trump make this big announcement, first at the Port of Baltimore, and then again at the White House Rose Garden, really kind of laying out this two-tiered tariff system.
So what's interesting is that copper, computer chips, lumber, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, they're temporarily exempt from the reciprocal tariffs, but it could change. Steel, aluminum, autos, those are things that had already been tariffed previously, so they weren't really part of this. And then on April 5th, just a few days later, that baseline 10% tariff on just everything else coming into the U.S., that went into effect.
Right. So by April 9th, we've got the broad 10% and then sort of this additional reciprocal tariff on top of that. Now, the way these reciprocal tariffs were calculated is you take the bilateral goods trade deficit that a country has with the U.S. and you divide that by the goods that U.S. exports to that country.
Okay, so it sounds pretty straightforward. But the American Enterprise Institute, we'll call them the AEI, they released their analysis on April 4th.
Okay.
They had some pretty strong criticisms. Their basic argument is that this formula, quote, does not make economic sense. So unpack that for us.
Yeah, so what's interesting here is they really attack the notion that a trade deficit, when a country imports more than it exports, is a simple matter of who's winning or losing in trade just because of tariffs.
Right.
A country's trade balance is affected by all sorts of things, like the flow of investments across borders, the global supply chain, the basic economic principle of comparative advantage, where countries specialize in things that they do best, or even just basic geography, like how close countries are to each other.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, there was also a quote from Marcus Noland at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He says it's, quote, very wrongheaded economics to think that, you can impose tariffs and expect everything to just kind of magically balance out with every country. Mm-hmm. It really ignores the natural ebbs and flows of, how countries trade with each other.
Exactly. So it really seems like these tariffs are based on this really simplistic view of trade, ignoring all the complex things that determine what countries buy and sell from each other.
Yeah. And the AEI didn't stop there. They identified, quote, a significant calculation error in this formula. They say that this error actually leads to a four-fold, so 4 times, overestimation of the tariffs that other countries are putting on U.S. goods.
Wow.
So a 4-fold overestimation. How does something like that happen?
So the core of it seems, is the type of elasticity that they're looking at.
Okay.
So the administration, it appears, mistakenly used the elasticity of retail prices in response to tariffs instead of the elasticity of import prices in response to tariffs. Wow. So it's kind of like the administration is looking at how much the price changes in the store for consumers.
Okay.
But what really matters for tariffs is how much the price coming into the country changes at the border.
Right.
They're measuring the wrong thing. And so there's this study by Alberto Cavallo and others, which the administration actually cited. And this study really clearly shows that when a tariff is imposed, almost all of that cost is passed on immediately to the price of the goods as they enter the U.S.
Okay.
And then the effect on the final price that, you or I see in the store, that's much more complicated and depends on other things.
So they're not comparing apples to apples. They're looking at two different stages of pricing.
Exactly.
And how they're affected by the tariff.
Exactly. And because of that, the AEI says the administration is severely underestimating how much import prices actually increase because of foreign tariffs.
Right.
And that leads to them calculating these, much larger reciprocal tariffs.
So if the AEI is correct about this calculation error, what does the real picture look like?
Well, their analysis suggests that if you correct this error, the reciprocal tariffs would be much, much smaller, like about 3/4 smaller. In fact, they even have data that shows how the announced tariffs would shrink if you use the correct elasticity.
Okay.
And so they estimate that, for almost all countries, they wouldn't face anything beyond that initial 10% tariff. In fact, they estimate that no country would actually have to pay more than 14% under this corrected formula,
Okay.
with most hitting that 10% floor.
Wow. So it's really not these aggressive reciprocal penalties. It's really kind of just a broad tariff with some minor adjustments for certain countries.
Right.
And the AEI's final assessment, they say, quote, that this entire formula lacks a foundation in either economic theory or trade law.
Yeah. Really calling into question kind of the whole basis of this.
So given this new system and the tariffs going live, what was the immediate reaction kind of in the markets and the economy around that April 8th, 9th deadline?
Yeah, well, the sources really point to a pretty immediate sort of turbulence. We saw a pretty significant sell-off in U.S. markets on Tuesday afternoon, leading into the tariffs taking effect. And that wasn't just the U.S.
Right.
There was a broader sort of global market instability. You saw declines in kind of equities in many regions, and even a jump in U.S. Treasury yields, which is, generally a sign that investors are getting more risk-averse, looking for safer investments.
Right. And the stock market in the U.S. itself took a pretty significant hit. The AEI noted that the S&P 500, which is kind of a broad measure of U.S. stock performance, lost about 9% of its value around that time.
Yeah. And in addition to the market volatility, we also started seeing more predictions for a recession. I think there was a lot of uncertainty that these tariffs injected into the global economic outlook.
Yeah. And, you saw some pretty clear warnings from some big names in finance. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, in his annual letter, pointed to, likely inflationary outcomes. He said it wouldn't just affect import prices, but it would likely push up domestic prices too, because of higher costs for businesses and higher demand for local goods.
Right.
He anticipated, just slower growth.
And, Joe Bruce Willis, who is chief economist at RSMUS, he was also pretty blunt. He described a free fall in financial markets and even raised concerns about a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar itself.
Wow.
He even talked about, devaluation of the dollar and a challenge to its status as a, reserve currency. So that's a pretty significant warning from a pretty well-respected economist.
Absolutely. And Seung-Won Son at Loyola Marymount University, he laid out some potential negative impacts in pretty stark terms. He offered a best case and a worst case scenario. And both of them included things like, contractions in GDP, that's the total value of goods and services produced in a country, job losses, and higher inflation. So even his most optimistic outlook wasn't super encouraging.
Yeah. And these weren't just voices in the U.S. The Bank of England, which is the central bank of the U.K., they also warned about intensified risks to both the global and U.K. economy from these tariffs, indicating a real possibility of, further sharp corrections in financial markets.
So kind of across the board, the initial reaction was, at least in the financial markets, quite negative. And a lot of experts are raising some, pretty significant concerns about rising prices, slower growth, and even, the U.S. dollar's position in the world.
Yeah.
So how did the rest of the world respond to these new tariffs? What were the initial reactions from some of our big trading partners?
Well, unsurprisingly, the response wasn't very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
So China, facing what reports suggested could be like 104% tariff on their goods entering the U.S., they immediately sort of said they would take resolute and forceful countermeasures to protect their own economic interests. And it wasn't just talk. They quickly announced they would be increasing their own tariffs on goods imported from the U.S. to 84%.
Wow. So like a full-on trade war.
Yeah. It really does look like that. In fact, Carlos Gutierrez, the former U.S. Commerce Secretary, said we're looking at a full-blown trade war with China now.
Wow. So what about Europe?
Well, the EU, facing a 20% duty, they also expressed their willingness to negotiate. Ursula von der Leyen, who's president of the European Commission, she said they're open to discussions.
Okay.
However, they were also really clear that they're preparing to retaliate. And Bernd Lange, who's a prominent EU trade official, he made a really interesting point that the EU is looking to broaden its network of trading partners, specifically with places like China and Vietnam.
Wow.
As a way to kind of uphold a rules-based international trade order in the face of these unilateral actions by the U.S.
So you could see the EU potentially aligning with countries like China, who are also, heavily impacted by these tariffs, to kind of push back against this new U.S. policy.
Exactly.
And, what about other key players like Turkey?
Yeah, so President Erdogan of Turkey actually commented that he thinks Turkey will weather this period of tariff uncertainty better than many other countries.
Okay.
And his reasoning was that Turkey faces relatively low tariffs compared to some of these other targeted countries.
Right.
So while Turkey, as a major global exporter, still faces that baseline 10% tariff,
right,
it might be that their kind of lower trade deficit with the U.S. puts them in a slightly less targeted position under the reciprocal tariff formula.
So, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
You've got outright retaliation from China, willingness to negotiate, but preparing for countermeasures from the EU, and, countries like Turkey who are a little bit more optimistic because they think they're less affected.
Right. It's a real mix of global reaction.
So let's kind of dig into some specific sectors of the economy and the concerns that they're raising, even for those sectors that were initially exempt from the reciprocal tariffs.
Right. This is where we start to see kind of the widespread impact that this could have across the economy. So let's take, for example, copper and critical minerals. The U.S. relies heavily on imports for copper. Like about half of the copper we use comes from other countries.
Right.
And the demand for copper is only going to grow as things like AI, blockchain, and the defense sector all increase.
Right.
Dan Ikenson, who's a trade policy expert, pointed out that the time it takes to develop domestic mining and refining capacity is extremely long, like 16 to 18 years, just to get the permits for a new mine.
Wow.
So putting tariffs on these really essential imports, it risks, really disrupting existing supply chains and driving up costs across industries that rely on these materials.
Yeah. And, that has a knock-on effect for all sorts of other industries that use copper, like the construction sector, electronics manufacturing,
Right.
things like that. So what about lumber? That's another sector that was initially exempt.
Yeah, lumber is crucial for home building, right? And the U.S. imports a lot of its softwood lumber, about 30%. And home builders are already worried that tariffs in this sector, especially on top of the existing duties on Canadian lumber, could really worsen the housing affordability crisis.
Yeah.
And it's not just new homes, right? Higher lumber prices can also drive up the cost of furniture or even things like toilet paper.
Wow.
And there's this recent and somewhat controversial move to open up more national forests for logging, which is happening in this context
Right.
with the goal of increasing domestic lumber supply. But of course, that raises all sorts of environmental issues.
Yeah. So it seems like even these sectors that were initially given a pass are not necessarily, safe from potential negative consequences.
Right.
And the pharmaceutical industry is an interesting one, given all the discussion about, the cost of prescription drugs
Yeah.
in this country.
It's a really interesting situation.
Yeah.
So Dietrich Stadig, who's an economist at ING, he pointed out this conflict between the different policy goals.
Okay.
On the one hand, there's this goal of lowering drug prices. And then on the other hand, there's this push to increase domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals by using tariffs.
Right.
But the likely outcome is that tariffs on, pharmaceutical ingredients and finished drugs will actually lead to higher prices.
Okay.
So it's kind of this unintended consequence.
Right.
Stadig actually gave an example of a commonly prescribed medication potentially increasing in price by $42 per year under a 25% tariff. And for more complex treatments, the cost increase could be thousands of dollars a year.
Wow.
And on top of that, setting up new facilities for generic drug production takes a long time, like 10 years.
Wow.
So these tariffs that are meant to encourage domestic production could end up making healthcare less affordable for a lot of Americans, at least in the short and medium term.
Yeah. And finally, let's talk about semiconductors. We're hearing a lot about the strategic importance of bringing chip manufacturing back to the U.S.
Right. And while the Chi-Chi-Pes Act is a big step towards boosting domestic production,
Right.
John Dallasas at the University of Illinois pointed out a key problem. The U.S. still lacks enough capacity in the area of, advanced electronic assembly.
Okay.
So even if we make more of the actual semiconductor chips here,
Right.
they'll likely still need to be sent overseas for assembly into things like smartphones, computers, cars,
Right.
And then those finished products would be subject to these new tariffs when they come back into the U.S.
Right.
So even with more chips being made here, tariffs could still lead to higher prices for electronics.
Right.
And as Dallasas put it, chips are often considered the crude oil of the 21st century.
Right.
So they're pretty fundamental to our modern life.
So across all these key sectors, even the ones that were initially spared from the reciprocal tariffs, there are some serious concerns about disruptions, increased costs, and kind of, unintended consequences that could affect the whole economy.
Exactly. The global economy is so interconnected that these tariffs are likely to have far-reaching effects that we're just beginning to understand.
So to sum up, we've seen these really broad new tariffs and a lot of questions from economists about the underlying logic and potential calculation errors. We've seen the immediate negative reaction in global markets and escalating trade tensions with major partners like China and the EU who are retaliating or preparing to retaliate.
Right.
And there's a lot of uncertainty about the economic impact, both in the short term and the long term. What's going to happen to inflation, to economic growth, to jobs in different sectors, and even the stability of the dollar. These are all open questions, right?
Absolutely.
It's important to remember this is a really fluid situation.
Yeah.
We could see more tariffs on the sectors that were initially exempt, and we're definitely going to see more reactions from our global partners.
And that brings up a really crucial point to consider. Given all this complexity and all the criticism from economists and the potential downsides, what do you think is the ultimate goal of these tariffs? And more importantly, who do you think will ultimately bear the brunt of their impact?
Absolutely. So hopefully this deep dive has given you kind of a starting point for understanding this big shift in U.S. trade policy.
Right.
It's complex. It has the potential for really broad consequences, and staying informed is going to be critical as we move forward. We encourage you to share your thoughts, any questions that this deep dive has sparked for you.
Right.
Let us know. And join us next time for another deep dive into.
Oh, we can't wait.
Well, we'll save that for next time. But for now, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.